The Pitt's India Act, a turning point in British rule in India. Imagine being a British officer stationed in India in the 18th century. The sun beats down on the vast subcontinent, but behind your uniform there's a storm brewing. British control over India is uncertain, its administration is corrupt, and the power of the East India Company seems unchecked. Enter the Pitt's India Act of 1784, an act that fundamentally reshapes British governance in India. Watch till the end as we'll break down key insights, and I've got some practice questions for your UPSC prep. What was the Pitt's India Act and what did it aim to achieve? In 1784, British Parliament passed the Pitt's India Act, named after William Pitt the Younger, the British Prime Minister at the time. The Act was a direct response to the mounting concerns over the East India Company's mismanagement of its territories in India. For years, the company had been an autonomous force in India, amassing power, wealth, and influence beyond what anyone, including the British government, could control. The core issue was the unchecked power of the East India Company. The company, both a trading corporation and a political entity, had grown so powerful that it was essentially acting as a state within a state. The British government had to intervene, especially after the disastrous results of the company's military adventures, like the debacle in the Carnatic War between 1746 and 1751 and mounting administrative mismanagement. The Pitt's India Act aimed to curb this unchecked power, stabilize governance, and reduce corruption. It was not just a legal reform, it was a crucial shift in British colonial strategy, marking the beginning of the British government taking direct control over Indian affairs, a precursor to the British Raj that would take full shape by 1858. How did the Pitt's India Act restructure the East India Company's power? The most significant impact of the Pitt's India Act was the creation of the Board of Control, a new body established to oversee the East India Company's operations in India. Before this, the company was largely free to make its own decisions with minimal intervention from the British Parliament. Now, the Board of Control, consisting of 6 members appointed by the British government, was empowered to supervise the company's affairs. It had the authority to direct the company's military and administrative decisions. Alongside this, the Governor-General of India was given broader powers. Previously, the Governor-General was mainly focused on trade and economic matters. After the Act, the Governor-General's role expanded to include governance and military decisions, bringing the company's military operations under tighter British control. The new structure effectively shifted the company's focus from trade to governance, making the company more of an imperial institution than a business entity. Why did the Pitt's India Act matter? Why is the Pitt's India Act so important? Because it marked the first substantial attempt by Britain to exercise direct control over India's administration. Prior to the Act, British policies were influenced mainly by the East India Company's interests, and British officials often acted as mere facilitators of the company's expansion. With the Pitt's India Act, we see the emergence of a clear division between the political and commercial aspects of the company's rule. The Act laid the groundwork for the establishment of the British Raj, the formal British colonial rule over India, which would take full shape after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. In essence, the Pitt's India Act was a first step toward consolidating British power over India and shifting from indirect rule via the East India Company to direct rule by the British Crown. This shift also initiated a more centralized form of governance in India, with decisions coming directly from London rather than from the interests of a private company. What was the role of the Board of Control? The creation of the Board of Control was one of the most important elements of the Pitt's India Act. It was meant to separate the political functions of the East India Company from its commercial interests. This meant that, while the company still had control over trade, it no longer had the authority to make political decisions in India without oversight. The Board of Control was given extensive powers over the administration of India, including the military, civil, and financial matters. It could now review and approve decisions made by the East India Company's Court of Directors, who were previously in charge of managing the company's operations in India. The British government, through the board, had the final say over major decisions, ensuring that Indian affairs aligned more closely with British interests. How did the Act affect the political structure in India? One of the most significant outcomes of the Pitt's India Act was the creation of the Governor-General of India. This was not an entirely new position, but the Act expanded the powers of the Governor-General significantly. Previously, the Governor-General had a limited role, often overshadowed by the influence of the East India Company's officials. After the Pitt's India Act, the Governor-General became the highest authority in India. The Governor-General would have full control over the military and political matters in India. The Act also established a Council of Four, which acted as advisors to the Governor-General. This centralization of power marked a significant shift from the earlier decentralized structure where regional companies and officials had more autonomy. This new political structure made it easier for the British to govern India from a central point, reducing the influence of the East India Company's regional divisions. What were the shortcomings of the Pitt's India Act? Despite its revolutionary changes, the Pitt's India Act had its shortcomings. First, it did not fully eliminate the corrupt and inefficient practices that were prevalent within the East India Company. While it curtailed the company's political powers, it did not change its business model, which was still based on profit-driven motives. As a result, the company continued to face issues of corruption, exploitation, and mismanagement in its dealings with India. Moreover, the Act's restrictions on the company's military activities did not prevent future military setbacks. It failed to address the root causes of the East India Company's failures, including the lack of trained personnel and effective communication systems. These issues would later contribute to the problems that led to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Lastly, the Pitt's India Act did not shift the British mindset about the indigenous population of India. It did little to prevent the social and economic exploitation of Indian subjects, nor did it encourage the development of any kind of participatory political system. The British government maintained a firm grip on power with little concern for the welfare of the Indian people. How does the Pitt's India Act relate to modern India? The Pitt's India Act laid the groundwork for the later development of the British Raj. By establishing the Board of Control and expanding the powers of the Governor-General, it set the stage for greater British involvement in India's administration. It's important to understand this shift in governance when studying modern India because it illustrates how colonial rule evolved from a trade-focused model to one based on direct control over the political and military aspects of governance. For students preparing for the UPSC exam, understanding the Pitt's India Act is essential. It provides insight into the evolution of British colonial governance and helps contextualize later legislative developments such as the Government of India Act 1858, which established a direct British Crown rule over India. How can you use this topic for UPSC exam preparation? The Pitt's India Act is critical for both the prelims and main sections of the UPSC exam. This topic helps in understanding the evolution of British rule in India, particularly the shift from company rule to direct British control. The legislative measures that led to these changes are often tested in both the history and general studies papers. For prelims, focus on the provisions of the Pitt's India Act, the roles of the Governor-General and the Board of Control. Review questions related to British reforms in colonial India, as these have appeared in past exams. For mains, you can expect questions that ask you to analyze the effects of this act on India's political structure, its role in the rise of British imperial control, and its long-term impact on Indian society. Practice questions on the Pitt's India Act, the East India Company, and the structure of British colonial governance. What can we learn from the Pitt's India Act today? The Pitt's India Act of 1784 was a turning point in the history of British India. It reshaped the way India was governed, establishing a system that would eventually lead to direct British rule. From a modern perspective, we can learn a great deal about the role of governance in empire building, the dangers of unchecked corporate power, and the legacy of colonial rule. For UPSC aspirants, understanding this act provides valuable insight into the nature of colonial governance and the transformation of India's political landscape. Whether you're tackling questions on colonial administration or discussing the broader implications of British rule, the Pitt's India Act is a vital piece of the puzzle. Now that we've explored the intricacies of the Pitt's India Act, its origins, its objectives, and its impact on British governance in India, let's challenge your understanding of the topic with a few questions. These questions are designed not only to reinforce what we've discussed, but also to give you a sense of how this subject could be tested in the UPSC exams. So, let's jump into some thought-provoking questions to see how well you've grasped the details of this important act. Here comes the first question. Which of the following provisions was introduced by the Pitt's India Act of 1784? Our options include A. Creation of the post of Viceroy of India, B. Establishment of the Board of Control, C. Introduction of the Indian Civil Services, D. Granting of full legislative powers to the East India Company. The answer is B. Establishment of the Board of Control. Why? The Pitt's India Act of 1784 created the Board of Control tasked with overseeing the East India Company's political and military affairs in India. This act marked a pivotal shift where the British government began taking more direct control over the company's operations. Question 2. Which one of the following was not a function of the Board of Control established by the Pitt's India Act of 1784? Options are A. To control the military and political administration of India, B. To oversee the financial accounts of the East India Company, C. To directly manage trade and commercial activities in India, D. To direct the policies of the Governor General and his council. Answer is C. To directly manage trade and commercial activities in India. Why? While the Board of Control was responsible for overseeing political and military operations, it did not manage trade. Trade remained under the control of the East India Company, which continued to function as a commercial entity. Question 3. Which position was significantly empowered by the Pitt's India Act of 1784? Options are A. President of the East India Company, B. Governor General of India, C. Governor of Bengal, D. Secretary of State for India. The answer is B. Governor General of India. Why? The Pitt's India Act expanded the powers of the Governor General of India, making him the most powerful figure in the subcontinent, overseeing not only trade but also governance, military affairs, and political decisions. Question 4. How did the Pitt's India Act of 1784 address the issue of the East India Company's corruption and mismanagement? Options are A. It replaced the East India Company with direct crown rule. B. It introduced reforms to limit the company's control over military affairs but did not address corruption directly. C. It gave full powers to the British Parliament to oversee all company affairs. D. It created a judicial commission to directly investigate company officers. Answer is B. It introduced reforms to limit the company's control over military affairs but did not address corruption directly. Why? The Pitt's India Act aimed to curb the East India Company's military and political control by creating the Board of Control, but it did not fully address the root causes of corruption within the company itself. Lastly, question 5. Which of the following was a major outcome of the Pitt's India Act with respect to the governance of India? Options include A. Creation of a decentralized administration with more autonomy for local rulers, B. Establishment of direct British Crown rule over India, C. Formation of a centralized governance under the control of the British government, D. Introduction of the Indian Penal Code. The answer is C. Formation of a centralized governance under the control of the British government. Why? The Pitt's India Act centralized governance by establishing British governmental oversight through the Board of Control and enhancing the powers of the Governor General. This shift laid the foundation for British Crown rule, which came fully into effect after 1858. Great job tackling these questions. As you can see, the Pitt's India Act wasn't just a reform. It was a cornerstone in the transformation of British India from a company-run operation to a centrally governed empire. Understanding the provisions and the consequence of this act is crucial for both UPSC prelims and mains, and it helps contextualize later developments in Indian history. Keep practicing similar questions to solidify your grasp on colonial administrative reforms and always relate them back to the bigger picture of India's journey toward independence. Stay sharp and keep up the hard work.